Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. Sheldon, well, they finally found those infamous WMDs in Iraq. As you'll recall, that was the excuse, the initial excuse for invading Iraq. We had all those, color charts and graphs and everything showing how U.S. officials were absolutely convinced that there were those WMDs and even worse, that Saddam Hussein was getting ready to attack the United States with them. And they conjured up mushroom clouds and biological and chemical warfare and all kinds of other bogus excuses as we were writing at the time, back in 2002, for invading Iraq. And as we all know, they invade and they conduct their extensive searches, and lo and behold, no WMDs, except for one thing. The Washington Post reported in an extremely long story, one of the longest stories I've ever seen, starting up on the front page and continuing through 4 more pages, that they really did find those WMDs starting around 2004. And they kept it all secret. It was, to me, just a clear-cut case of a cover-up. Now, why would they cover up the WMDs that they were using to justify their invasion? I'll throw that question back at you now.
Well, the reason the Bush administration didn't come forth with this information is because this stuff was made in the United States. The components were made in the United States. The assembly line was set up by Western companies. It was all done. It all dated back from the 80s when the U.S. encouraged Iraq to attack Iran, because Iran was our bête noire. Still is, of course, but it was a bête noire in the 80s, and Saddam was on the U.S. side, and we were counting on Saddam to deal a huge blow to the Iranians. And Saddam's army invaded Iran in 1980. And the U.S. was giving it satellite and other forms of intelligence so it could guide its attack. And it gave it the makings of chemical weapons and advice. And Eric Margolyes, a great war journalist, has interviewed 2 British citizens who were members of the British government in those days, who were right on the scene helping Saddam set up this factory and this capability. So they knew about this all along. And as Margolyes reminds us, back in those days when the hawks were saying they have WMD, they have chemical weapons, our side, the critics of war, the opponents of war, used to say, well, of course we know they have WMDs. We have the receipts. That was not really a joke. That was only half of a tongue in cheek, because we were alluding to this fact that the U.S. and I think other Western countries, NATO countries, helped supply Saddam with the chemical weapons. Now, these weapons that they found were not active. There was no active program, as Bush used to tell us. These were decaying weapons that were placed in a location that the UN ordered Saddam to place them in, so that they would decay and not be good anymore. That's all they found. And the reason they didn't tell anybody, aside from the embarrassment, was they didn't want the Made in USA stamp seen. And as a result of the secrecy, the Bush administration is directly responsible for serious injury to American troops who were there, looking around for the WMD and digging this stuff up. And they were exposed to mustard gas and some other things. It's a total disgrace. It just shows you that the curse of the Bush administration lives on, even though it's long out of power.
Yeah, it damaged troops and hurt troops that they don't even want to talk about. In fact, they treat those injured troops as if they were inconveniences. And, of course, since they're trying to cover up, or were trying to cover up, the discovery of these weapons of mass destruction that the U.S. had provided Saddam Hussein, the treatment of these guys naturally is going to be second rate. But you raised several fascinating points that I think a lot of Americans don't know about, or many don't even want to know about. But in the run-up to the Iraq War, when the Bush administration was coming up with all this WMD hype, which was post 9/11, of course, so people were still scared to death that the terrorists were going to come and get us and so forth. So they were willing to fall for anything. And I remember during that time, the Future of Freedom Foundation was taking a steadfast position against invading Iraq. And we were writing articles on this. I've never seen so much hate mail flooding into FFF in the 25-year history that we didn't know what we were talking about, that we've got to trust the president. He has access to information that we don't have, that he would never lie about this. He'd never come up with any bogus reasons, and that clearly those WMDs were there. And we said, well, yeah, of course they're there. As you say, we have the receipts. The U.S. provided them. And my hunch always was that their plan was to find some of these WMDs that they had provided Saddam and have this grand celebration that they had discovered his WMD program. But as you pointed out, it wasn't a vibrant WMD program. It was a bunch of like artillery shells filled with mustard gas and the like that were buried or put underwater in some lake or something like that, only to be discovered by U.S. troops in 2004. And you raised another point here. And you know, when I think it was around 2002 that I wrote an article. Well, it wasn't really an article, but it was a list of links. And the title of the article, they can be found on our website. You can just Google, where did Iraq get its weapons of mass destruction, or its WMDs? And I had a whole list of links alluding to the fact that the U.S. had provided these WMDs to Iraq. And that list is still there. Now, why would they do that? As you pointed out, here was the U.S. partnering with this man, Saddam Hussein. Bush was calling him the new Hitler, that this man's a threat to world peace. But lost in all this was they were partnering with this new Hitler. I mean, Saddam Hussein was no different in the 80s than he was in the 90s and the early 2000s. Same brutal dictator. And the U.S. was partnering with him, as you pointed out. Why? To kill Iranians. That's why they were furnishing him the mustard gas and so forth, so that he would use them to kill Iranians. And why did the U.S. want their partner Saddam Hussein to kill Iranians? Because the Iranian people had the audacity to oust the U.S. CIA installed dictator, the Shah of Iran, from power, and install, of course, another dictatorship. But the U.S. was angry about that. They're still angry about it. That when the U.S. installs a dictatorship in a country, the people there should be willing to live under that dictatorship for as long as the U.S. wants. So this whole thing is just mired in crookedness and corruption.
Right, and you used a very important word. You said shells, and that's important because these when they were still viable weapons, were battlefield tactical weapons with a range of no more than 100 meters. In other words, these were not strategic weapons. There's no way these could have threatened Americans unless an American army invaded Iraq. That's assuming they were still intact. Of course, like, as I said, they had degraded and eroded. They weren't usable. But even if they had been usable, they couldn't have hurt Americans unless the U.S. Army was invading. These were battlefield weapons for fighting the Iranians. They couldn't put them on a missile and shoot them across the ocean into the United States. So they're never a threat to the American people. You're right. The Bush administration used to talk about how imminent an attack, and I've used that word, but that was certainly the sense they wanted to give the American people, that an attack by Iraq was could be coming at any time. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain, who was Bush's closest ally in all this, said in one of his speeches that with 45 minutes notice, the Iraqis could have nuclear weapons ready for us. And then how many times did Bush and Condoleezza Rice, his national security advisor, say that we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud? I just last night saw a documentary that had those clips. They tried to scare the heck out of the American people. And then of course we had Colin Powell, Secretary of State Powell's famous speech before the UN Security Council, where he had all these pictures of alleged mobile chemical laboratories and various things that he claimed that defectors had information provided to the United States. He knew that the intelligence behind that was non-existent. Although he had the head of the CIA sitting behind him and other officials sitting behind him, and just about every member of the media after that speech, including the New York Times, said, okay, it's a done deal. Powell has given us the goods. There's no doubt now it's time to go to war against Saddam Hussein, and it was all a lie. And let's pay tribute to the journalists who were saying it at the time. You're right that Future Freedom Foundation and some other libertarians were pounding away at this. But there was frontline reporting by the reporters of the late Knight Ridder Corporation, Jonathan Landay in particular, and Warren Strobel, who every day was running articles that's from inside the intelligence community. In other words, they were talking to people inside the intelligence agency saying they don't have the intelligence on this. This is bogus. This is coming from Chalabi and other alleged defectors who are really Iranian agents that the neoconservatives were putting up as the new George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons of Iraq. They turned out to be complete frauds. And as far as our alliance, the U.S. alliance with Saddam, let us never forget, it should be burnished on our brain, that photograph from the 1980s when Donald Rumsfeld was shaking hands with Saddam Hussein on the deal about Iran and other close relations with the U.S. Rumsfeld, of course, was the Secretary of Defense under Bush. So the whole thing is a fraud. The American people were so thoroughly lied to and fooled that it's outrageous, and this is why everybody should be totally skeptical about what's being said now about Iraq and Syria regarding ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, that after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Empire got dismantled, the national security state was in a panic. I mean, I remember there were people talking about a peace dividend, which meant we're going to downsize the national security establishment now. Because let's keep in mind that the reason this whole giant standing army, military bases overseas in an imperialist fashion, the CIA, the reason all these were brought into existence, which they were an alien form of government as far as our founding principles were concerned, but their justification was the Cold War. And in 1989, the Cold War is over. And so these guys are starting to panic and they need they need more justification. And I remember at the time they were saying, oh, don't downsize us. We can fight the drug war. We can help American businesses overseas. But in fact, Saddam Hussein, their former partner, gave them the excuse that Saddam gets into this dispute with Kuwait over oil drilling. There was an allegation that Kuwait was slant drilling. And Saddam runs it by the U.S., says, I got this problem. And there's that famous exchange with U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie, where she essentially says, look, we don't get involved in these kind of disputes. And so Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait to settle this dispute. And all of a sudden, now we've got this new Hitler and so forth. And so they go and they massacre a bunch of Iraqis as part of this process. But they leave Saddam Hussein in power, much to the chagrin of both conservatives and later neocons. And I remember throughout the 90s that Saddam Hussein was the new boogeyman. He's like the ISIS or the Osama bin Laden or the communist threat. That every day people, oh, Saddam Hussein is in power. We need to go in there and get him out. We need to finish the job. And that's what those sanctions were all about. And, of course, you were writing a lot about the sanctions that were killing Iraqi children. And prior to 9/11, we were writing, especially you, that if these sanctions don't stop, if this type of interventionism doesn't stop in the Middle East, we're going to see a major terrorist attack on American soil. So it was clear to me, Sheldon, that they were, especially when the sanctions failed to oust Saddam Hussein from power, that they were looking for an excuse to get rid of this guy. And the only way to get rid of him was through an invasion. So 9/11 comes along where the terrorists are saying, this is what is driving us to commit anti-American terrorism, including the sanctions that were killing these Iraqi children. And they go in there, they need an excuse. And, I mean, it was clear that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, although they were trying to stretch it. They were trying to connect him so they could say this is a self-defense measure. But in reality, it was a simple war of aggression, the type of war that was banned at Nuremberg, punished at Nuremberg, one country attacking another country without justification. And that was the U.S. The U.S. was the offensive power here. It was the aggressor power, but it needed an excuse. And that's what those WMDs are about. And that's what something that the American people, or at least the people of Congress, have never wanted to confront. The idea always was that it was a simple mistake, an honest mistake. But nobody ever wanted an official investigation to show there was no honest mistake here. This was a deliberate manufacture of a bogus reason to invade this country, and an invasion that took the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed the entire country, installed a dictatorial regime, and now is in total chaos with civil war, providing a new official enemy called ISIS that we're all supposed to be scared about.
Well, and let's not forget, when it comes to manufacturing threats, let's not forget Iran, which we've already mentioned. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it's true, the national security state was fearful of, and as well as the intellectuals outside of the government structure who helped fuel the ideology for this thing, like the neoconservatives, were concerned that there was going to be a downsizing of the Pentagon and of intelligence. Like you said, people were looking forward to maybe having their taxes lowered because not so much would be needed with the Soviet Union off the scene. Well, that put people into a panic, and it was beginning in about 1990. The Soviet Union falls apart in 1991. So under Bush and then under Clinton, they effectively manufacture the Iranian nuclear scare, and Israel is a party to this too, which had an obvious interest in having this alleged monster, threatening everybody in the Middle East, because it would make sure there'd be no, fall in how much aid is given to Israel, which gets about $3 billion a year in military assistance and weapons and things like that. So they manufacture the Iran nuclear threat because the Clinton people especially thought that nuclear proliferation was a great way to scare the American people and into supporting a big military establishment and intelligence establishment. So they came up, not only did they use that with Saddam, that he supposedly had a nuclear program, but they said the Iranians had a nuclear program. The Iranians never had a weapons nuclear program, and if you want the documentation, and people should pick up Gareth Porter's great book, Manufactured Crisis. I wrote a series of articles about it, which they can find at the FFF site. And so that was another one. And in fact, the Pentagon geniuses came up with the theory of dual containment. Both Saddam and Iran, the Ayatollah, would be contained by the new U.S. strategy. So it was known as dual containment. And the interesting thing we should keep in mind with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein, which supposedly completed the work that the first Bush administration didn't do. Remember, when they tossed Saddam out of Kuwait, they only rolled back the army. They didn't invade Baghdad and bomb Baghdad and drive Saddam out of power. That was left to Bush Jr. And they knew when they did that they were basically turning Iraq over to Iran, because the Shiites were the suppressed minority under Saddam. And if you knock out Saddam, the Shiites are going to be the dominant power. And ever since it's been a government friendly to Iran. Why did they do that if Iran is also our nemesis? I have a feeling the next step was to go after Iran. And, like you say, the result is a total mess in Iraq and Syria now with ISIS, which doesn't represent a threat to Americans at home, but they don't want us to know that. And here you go. It's what I call the perpetual motion machine, right? The more the U.S. government does in allegedly fighting terrorism and other kinds of threats, the more threat it produces. It's a beautiful system for the military-industrial complex and the national security state.
Oh, it's the perfect system. I mean, it is the perfect racket, because they generate their own crises, which are then used for more intervention and more, of course, military budgets and budgets for the defense contractors. And I put defense in quotation marks because it's really all about empire. But you're absolutely right about this manufacturing of the scaring of WMDs in Iran. And it's a fascinating scenario how they do this and how successful they are. Because after the fiasco with Iraq came up, where everybody realized, hey, I think we've been duped here, at least the smart people were realizing they've been duped, they end up falling for the same thing with Iran. And I find that fascinating that U.S. officials just got through pulling the fast one on the American people with Iraq, use the exact same fear-mongering And it succeeds. There's a lot of people that buy into it. Oh my gosh. Okay. They didn't get it right on Iraq, but this time they have access to information that we just don't have. And is of course bogus in the beginning, same bogus rationale for invading Iraq. And that series of articles that you wrote that was reviewing Gareth Porter's book were fantastic. I recommend anybody watching this video to look up those articles by Sheldon reviewing Gareth Porter's book and to buy the book. He shows it's all just bogus again. And the other thing I'd like to mention, though, Sheldon, was how they seamlessly went when they didn't find these WMDs. Now, what would have been the natural reaction of a country that has garnered, domestic support for invading a country that had nothing to do with 9/11, totally innocent of 9/11, and now turns out to be innocent of WMDs and attacking the United States, mushroom clouds and so forth? Seems to me the natural reaction would be, gosh, we made a mistake here. We're really sorry. We've killed a bunch of people. We've tortured people in Abu Ghraib that had nothing to do with 9/11. There's no WMD program here. We're really sorry. We're leaving. We're going home. And that's not what they did. They said, well, now that we're here, let's just go ahead and convert this into a love for the Iraqi people. And we've really just loved the Iraqi people so much that we're doing this for them. We're bringing them democracy. We're bringing them a free society through a military invasion. And what was fascinating to me about all this is their willingness to kill any number of Iraqis. I mean, they loved them to death. That there was never an upward limit on the number of Iraqis that could be killed. That whatever number there was would be considered worth what they were trying to achieve, which was like a paradise in Iraq. And of course, it's been an absolute fiasco. We all know that. Everybody knows that it's been a fiasco. There is no free market paradise in Iraq. And all those people died for nothing. I mean, we always focus on the number of U.S. troops that were killed, but we very rarely, except those of us that are concerned about moral principles, we rarely focus on those that they killed. Hundreds of thousands of people, none of whom had anything to do with 9/11. I mean, the magnitude of that. And then the callousness of saying, well, the survivors will live a better life without Saddam in charge. It's kind of cavalier to say all those dead people, they don't matter because look what we've done for those that are still alive and many of whom are maimed without legs or arms and so forth. I mean, the moral catastrophe here to me is just, it's really predominant over just the practical aspects of how they destroyed a country.
Well, and they made predictions that went beyond the welfare of the Iraqi people. They said this was going to bring peace to the Middle East. They used to say, the neocons and the other strategists in the Bush administration used to say that the road to Jerusalem leads through Baghdad. In other words, it was going to end up even reconciling the Palestinians and the Israelis because Saddam allegedly was this great champion of the Palestinians. So once you get him out of the way, the Palestinians realize we lost an ally. Now we better sit down and talk to the Israelis, as if the Palestinians are the recalcitrant party in that dispute, in that conflict. As recently as just a year or so ago, or maybe 2 years ago, Ann Coulter, one of the pundits of on the neocon right, was talking about how Iraq is the Arab Israel, by which she means it's now a good friend and a democracy, and we should be very happy about what has happened there. I mean, these people live in a dream world. They can't even see failure when it stares them right in the face. And these same people get invited on TV now, and I'm talking about all the networks, not just Fox, to talk about why we should be at war with ISIS and other resurgents in Iraq and Syria. The same people, William Crystal, all the Kagans, all these people who got everything so wrong, and not just made a mistake, like you said, who lied to the American people about Iraq in 10 years ago, are the same people invited back to talk about why we need a new war in Iraq and a war in Syria. And of course, they also hate the idea that the U.S. is even talking to Iran about, the non-existent nuclear threat. So it's a rigged game from the start, and just about all the media with a few honorable exceptions, have fallen for it, and they learn nothing. And I have to feel that the reason they learn nothing is because they have no incentive to learn. People generally learn from mistakes when they have an incentive to. But if you're rewarded for sticking with the same old line, then why would you change it?
Yeah, these people have no shame at all. I mean, I agree with you. It's absolutely fascinating to me that after producing this giant fiasco, those pro-invasion war of aggression commentators are invited back to give the case for, doing more to Iraq, more intervention or intervention in Iran, sanctions, embargoes. In the concluding minutes, I'd like to focus in on this cover-up aspect. I think this is absolutely fascinating, too, is that it's clear that there's been a cover-up. I mean, all they had to do was announce, hey, we have found this cache of WMDs. There's been troops that have been damaged by this. They have mustard gas on them, and we just want to announce this to the public. They deliberately kept this secret. I mean, they ordered the troops, you will not disclose this. And they classified this information. It seems to me, Sheldon, that there's no good reason for this except a nefarious reason. And that is that they didn't want Americans to focus in on the fact that the U.S., had furnished Saddam with these WMDs. And how can that cover up not go investigated? I would think that Congress would be interested in saying, hey, let's have a hearing. What was the purpose of this? What was the purpose of keeping this secret from the American people? And I'd subpoena George W. Bush. I'd start right at the very top and say, did you know about this? And when did you know about it? And why did you keep it secret? Because I think it goes to the heart of the national security establishment. Lie to the American people. Don't disclose the truth to the American people. And when the American people might discover the dark side of the national security establishment, resort and revert to secrecy in order to keep them from learning what's going on in their name and with their taxes.
Look, as Obama said when he came into office, there will be no recriminations from the past. That's the past. We're going to look ahead. So in other words, let them all off scot-free. They all ought to be before the International Criminal Court. And Obama's interest in this is, of course, quite clear. He would hate to have his successor look back at his conduct. And the administration, Obama once before he was in office used to criticize Bush for claiming that the international treaty on torture, against torture, did not apply to the U.S. government conduct outside of the United States. The Obama administration, Obama criticized that. Now, once in office, they don't take that position. And there was a New York Times article the other day about how they're still debating within the administration over whether they should agree or not agree that treaty applies to U.S. conduct outside the United States. In other words, they have not taken a firm position on that question, which means they could go the other way and end up agreeing with Bush. So, of course, they don't want to look back at Bush because they're afraid that some president who follows him will look back at Obama. And so it's just, it's what side your bread is buttered on.
Oh, yeah, it's all the same party. It's one party divided into two wings, the Democrats and the Republicans, but they all share the same vision, they share the same principles, and they share the same corrupt attitude toward foreign interventionism and the massive destruction that they've wrought around the world with their national security establishment. Anyway, we run out of time, Sheldon. That's our show. That's the Libertarian Angle for this week. I'm Jacob Hornberger, joined by Sheldon Richman, and we'll see you next time.